They say some places aren't meant to be visited, that the earth itself breathes a sigh of ancient, malevolent secrets, and if you listen too closely, it might just whisper your name. The Appalachian Mountains, with their gnarled peaks, hollowed valleys, and mist-shrouded forests, are one such place. And what I'm about to tell you isn't some campfire tale spun for cheap thrills. This is a true account, verified by the shattered recollections of two people, Larry and Sarah, whose lives were irrevocably fractured by a single, unimaginable night. It was late autumn, just 2 years ago. Larry, a software engineer weary of the concrete jungle, convinced Sarah, a freelance graphic designer with a penchant for digital escapism, to trade their Brooklyn apartment for a remote cabin retreat in a lesser-known pocket of the southern Appalachians. They sought pristine air, stunning foliage, and a much-needed digital detox. What they found instead was a chilling descent into a reality far more terrifying than any SCREENSAVER. Their first day was crisp air, the invigorating scent of pine and damp earth, distant bird calls echoing through the valleys, an almost perfect quietude. But as the sun dipped behind the ancient ridges, casting long skeletal shadows, things began to shift. The vibrant autumn colors seemed to dull, the air grew unnaturally still, and the forest, previously a symphony of natural sounds, fell silent. Imagine you're with them now, walking that darkening trail. The light fades, but it's not just the absence of sun. It feels as though the light itself is being absorbed by the trees, by the very ground beneath your feet. Larry, always pragmatic, joked about the oppressive silence, but Sarah, ever more attuned to her surroundings, felt a prickle of unease on her skin. She swore she heard a faint, rhythmic scratching, like nails on wood, coming from deep within the unseen woods, but she dismissed it as her overactive imagination. That night, tucked away in their rustic cabin, the true horror began its insidious creep. Larry, lying awake, found his gaze drawn to the window. The moon was a sliver, barely strong enough to cut through the dense canopy. But there, flickering at the edge of his vision, was a shape. Too tall, too thin, too still to be an animal. He blinked, and it was gone. He rubbed his eyes, telling himself it was the play of shadows, the unfamiliar darkness of the wild. Would you have convinced yourself it was nothing, or would a knot of dread have tightened in your stomach? Sarah stirred beside him. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, laced with genuine fear. Larry hadn't, but her reaction was palpable. It sounded like crying, but not human, too high-pitched, too wet. The next morning, the unease gnawed at them. The air in the cabin felt heavy, oppressive, as if something unseen had settled within its walls. They decided to hike to a hidden waterfall they'd read about, hoping the physical exertion and the natural beauty would shake off the lingering dread, but the trail, previously well-defined, seemed to morph. Trees that were marked with trailblazers yesterday were now bare. The path grew narrower, the woods denser, the light barely penetrating the thick canopy. Larry started seeing them, to now fleeting glimpses of figures darting between trees, faces pressed against the bark, their eyes like obsidian chips reflecting the meager light. He'd stop, Sarah would ask what was wrong, and he'd just shake his head, convinced his mind was playing tricks. But the images grew more persistent, more grotesque. He saw gnarled hands reaching from behind tree trunks, elongated shadows that moved independently of the sun, and once, a fleeting, grinning face made of tangled branches and moss, its teeth like broken shards of flint. Sarah, meanwhile, was plagued by sound. The rhythmic scratching she'd heard before grew louder, more insistent, like something desperate trying to claw its way out of a tight space. Then came the whispers, indistinct at first, then coalescing into a guttural ancient language that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. She heard the snapping of twigs directly behind her, the heavy exhale of breath on her neck. But when she whirled around, there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence of the deep woods. Imagine that feeling, the absolute certainty of something being there, yet seeing nothing. Would you scream? Would you run? Or would you freeze, paralyzed by the sheer terror of unseen eyes upon you? The air itself seemed to grow colder, despite the exertion of their hike. A peculiar, sickly sweet smell, like rotten meat mixed with burnt sugar, clung to the air and intensified as they pushed deeper. Larry's throat felt dry, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt the cold touch of unseen fingers brush his cheek, the phantom weight of a hand pressing down on his shoulder. He kept checking over his shoulder, but still nothing. Just the endless, suffocating green. They were lost, completely, irrevocably lost. The waterfall was a myth, the path a cruel deception. Every turn looked the same, yet subtly different, as if the forest was actively rearranging itself around them. The trees seemed to press closer, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers, forming a cage. Larry stumbled, and as he fell, his hand landed on something wet and slick. He pulled it back, staring at the dark, viscous fluid coating his palm. It smelled metallic, like old blood. Then Sarah screamed, not a yelp of surprise, but a raw, tearing sound of absolute terror, a sound that ripped through the unnatural silence. Larry scrambled to his feet, eyes wide, looking at where she pointed with a trembling hand, and there it was. Not a hallucination, not a trick of the light or a figment of their exhausted minds. Looming between two ancient oaks, its form vaguely human but impossibly tall and thin, was a creature. Its skin was thecla of wet earth and decay, its limbs unnaturally long, ending in razor-sharp talons. Its head was a featureless, elongated skull, save for two cavernous black holes where eyes should be, and a gaping maw that stretched horrifyingly wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. It didn't move, but the air around it shimmered, pulsating, with a silent, malevolent energy. A low, guttural sound, like stones grinding together, emanated from it. It seemed to vibrate through the very air, rattling their teeth and vibrating in their bones. What would you do? Would you stand, mesmerized by terror, or would instinct kick in? Larry, filled with a primal surge of adrenaline, grabbed Sarah's hand. "Run," he screamed, his voice hoarse, and they bolted, blindly crashing through the undergrowth. Away from the impossible horror, they ran until their lungs burned, until their muscles screamed, until the world spun around them. The forest itself seemed to conspire against them, branches whipping at their faces, roots tripping their feet. Larry glanced back once, and in a fleeting gap in the trees, he saw it. It wasn't chasing them, not conventionally. It was simply there, always in the distance, always watching, always moving parallel to them, like a dark, silent guardian of the woods, ensuring they never truly escaped its gaze. Hours later, disoriented and delirious, they stumbled onto a gravel road. A lone pickup truck, appearing as if from nowhere, slowed and pulled over. The driver, an old man with eyes that had seen too much, just nodded slowly when they tried to babble their story. "The mountains. They got eyes and ears," he rasped. and sometimes they got teeth. He drove them, silently, to the nearest small town. They never looked back. They never told another soul the full extent of what they saw, not even each other. The words were too big, the images too deeply seared into their minds. Larry and Sarah are different now. They live miles apart, the unspoken horror a chasm between them. Larry suffers from night terrors, waking to the smell of decay and the chilling sensation of unseen hands upon him. Sarah can no longer bear silence. She sleeps with the TV on, convinced she hears the insidious scratching just beyond the walls. The Appalachian Mountains hold on to their secrets, and sometimes they just give you enough of a glimpse to ensure you're never truly free again. If this chilling account resonated with the strange whispers of your own imagination, hit that like button. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had an inexplicable experience in the wilderness? Subscribe to the channel for more true horror, stories that will make you question what you thought you knew about the world. This story, like so many others whispered in the shadowed hollows of the Appalachians, ends not with answers, but with a lingering question. Was it a shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear? Or are there entities within those ancient woods that defy explanation, waiting to imprint their horrifying essence onto those who dare to trespass? All we know is what Larry and Sarah endured, and one undeniable truth remains. Some places are best left alone, and the Appalachians, there, always watching, always listening, waiting. You know that feeling, right? That prickle on the back of your neck when you're utterly alone, deep in the woods, and you just know something is watching you, even if you can't see it. Now, imagine that feeling amplified, twisted, until it's all you can taste, all you can breathe. Forget campfire tales. What I'm about to tell you isn't some urban legend passed down on Reddit. This is a fragment of a nightmare that walked straight out of the Appalachian Mountains and sunk its teeth into a man named Buddy. And if you're brave enough to listen, to truly feel it, then keep watching, because this isn't just his story. It could be yours. The year was 1998. Buddy, a man who swore by the solitude of the wilderness, had ventured into a lesser-known stretch of the Allegheny Mountains, deep in West Virginia. He wasn't looking for adventure, just peace. He'd meticulously planned a 5-day loop, far from any established trails, relying on an old topographical map and his own compass. For the first 2 days, it was everything he'd hoped for: crisp autumn air leaves aflame with color, the rhythmic crunch of boots on fallen foliage. The only sounds were the rustle of unseen creatures and the distant murmur of a hidden creek. You're there with him, aren't you? The sun warm on your face, the scent of pine and damp earth filling your lungs. Pure serenity. But then it shifted. On the third afternoon, a peculiar silence fell. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but an abrupt, heavy stillness. The birds stopped singing. The rustling ceased. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Buddy, seasoned woodsman that he was, immediately felt it, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He checked his map. He checked his compass. He was still on course, but something felt profoundly off. The trees, once majestic and welcoming, now seemed to lean in, their ancient branches forming skeletal fingers against the bruised sky. Have you ever felt the forest turn on you? That's what Buddy felt. He pressed on, discomfort morphing into unease. He told himself it was just the fading light, the isolated environment playing tricks on his mind. But then came the whispers. You hear them too, don't you? Faint, like wind sighing through distant leaves, but too deliberate, too close. They weren't words, not exactly, but a low, guttural murmur that seemed to coil around his thoughts, raising the hairs on his arms. He stopped, straining his ears, but the moment he focused, they vanished, leaving only that oppressive silence. He pushed his pace, the easy stride of earlier replaced by a hurried, almost panicked march. He knew he needed to make camp before full dark. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and sickly orange, he spotted a small clearing. It wasn't ideal to open, close to a rocky outcrop, but the light was failing fast. You're shivering now, aren't you? Not from cold, but from something deeper. He quickly pitched his tent, his movements jerky, the whisper-like sounds seeming to pulse around him with every swing of his hammer. Inside, zipped into the flimsy nylon, he tried to calm himself. He fumbled for his small battery-powered lantern, its weak glow doing little to push back the encroaching darkness. And that's when the real horror began. The sounds outside started. Not animals, not natural. It was a rhythmic, dragging thud, like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor, punctuated by the snapping of twigs that sounded too large, too deliberate. Then, a scraping, a slithering. You're holding your breath, aren't you? Listening with Buddy. The sounds circled his tent, the source unseen, but undeniably there. He gripped his hunting knife, his knuckles white, sweat beading on his forehead. Despite the chill, then came the visual. The lantern flickered, a momentary dimming, and for that split second, through the thin fabric of his tent, Buddy saw it, a shadow. Not just any shadow, but one that seemed to detach itself from the surrounding darkness. Taller than any man, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. It moved with a jerky, almost mechanical grace, silhouetted against the faintest residual glow of the western sky. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. It was other. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. Hallucination, sleep deprivation, paranoia. He repeated the words like a mantra, but when he opened them, the shadow was closer, pressed against the tent, distorting the nylon. You can see the faint outline of its warped form, can't you? The way its head tilts, as if examining you through the fabric, and then the smell. A sudden, cloying stench. It wasn't the smell of decay or rot. It was something deeper, more primal, like damp earth, old blood, and something metallic, yet organic. It filled the small tent, thick and suffocating, making him gag. He pressed his face into his arm, trying to block it out, but it permeated everything. It was in his throat, in his lungs, poisoning the very air he breathed. He heard a low, wet gurgle right outside his tent. Then, a series of quick, sharp scratches, like claws dragging across stone. He screamed, a raw, terrified sound that was immediately swallowed by the vast, indifferent darkness of the mountains. He scrambled for the tent zipper, fumbling, his fingers numb with terror. He had to get out. He had to run. He burst out of the tent, heart hammering against his ribs, legs screaming for him to move. The shadow was gone, but the air was still thick with that putrid smell, and the clearing was no longer a clearing. It had transformed. The rocks weren't just rocks. They were twisted, moss-covered monoliths, their surfaces slick and glistening, as if something had recently crawled over them. The trees weren't just trees. Their branches seemed to writhe, their bark peeling like diseased skin, revealing an impossibly dark wood beneath. And everywhere he saw them. Not things standing, but things integrated into the landscape. Eyes, dozens of them. Red, glowing embers. In the darkness, embedded in the bark of trees, peering from behind rocks, even seemingly rising from the damp earth itself. They weren't fixed. They pulsed, shifted, narrowed, tracking his every frantic movement. You're seeing them too, aren't you? Those burning, malevolent pinpricks of light, watching you, judging you. Then, from the depths of the twisted forest, a sound ripped through the night. A shriek, not human, not animal. It was a sound that scraped against the very fabric of his sanity, a primal keening mixed with a tearing, rending noise that echoed and reverberated through the mountains. Buddy dropped his pack, abandoning everything. He ran blindly, crashing through undergrowth, thorns tearing at his skin, branches whipping his face. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away from it. Away from the eyes, away from the smell, away from the things he couldn't see but knew were there, just beyond the edge of his vision. Always following, he ran for what felt like hours, his lungs burning, his legs screaming. He stumbled, fell, picked himself up, driven by an instinct beyond fear, pure, unadulterated terror. The sounds, the smell, the eyes, they pursued him, not just externally, but from within his own mind, a horrifying symphony of psychological torment. He saw fleeting glimpses of distorted figures darting between trees, faces melting into the shadows, limbs elongated beyond human comprehension. Hallucinations fueled by exhaustion, terror, and perhaps something else. Something ancient and hungry that resided in those mountains. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible glow in the distance. A road, or what used to be one. He burst out of the tree line, gasping, collapsing onto cracked asphalt, his body racked with tremors. The oppressive silence of the mountains was replaced by the faint hum of distant civilization. He was still miles from anything but the pure, untainted darkness was gone. He lay there for a long time, dry heaving, trying to purge the sickening smell from his nostrils, the horrifying images from his mind. He never looked back, not once. He eventually flagged down a passing motorist, a kindly old woman who drove him to the nearest town, asking no questions about his disheveled appearance or vacant eyes. Buddy swore off the wilderness after that night. He never spoke of what happened. Not truly. He was no longer the same man. The quiet solitude he once cherished became a source of profound anxiety. He lived out his days in a small apartment in Toledo, Ohio, surrounded by concrete, the antithesis of the wild. But sometimes, when the streetlights flickered or the wind howled just right, you could see a shadow pass over his eyes. A flicker of those burning red embers in the darkness. So what do you think happened to Buddy out there? Was it just a man pushed to the brink by isolation and exhaustion, his mind playing cruel tricks? Or was there something else, something ancient and malevolent lurking in those forgotten corners of the Appalachian Mountains, waiting for someone to stray off the beaten path? Something that truly exists beyond our comprehension. If this story sent a shiver down your spine, if it made you question the shadows in your own room, then hit that like button. We've got more tales from the edge of sanity coming. And if you want to be notified every time we delve into the dark corners of the human experience, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Tell me in the comments below, what's the creepiest thing you've ever experienced in the wild? Could it have been something like what Buddy encountered? Or do you think it was all in his head? The mountains keep their secrets well, but sometimes, just sometimes, they let a piece of their darkness escape. And once it touches you, it never truly lets go. If you dare to know what lies beneath the serene beauty of those old hills, then lean in, silence your notifications, and prepare yourself. And if you find this story as profoundly disturbing as the truth demands, please consider hitting that like button, dropping a comment, and subscribing. It helps us share these hidden accounts, these warnings, with others. It was late October, the kind of brutal, beautiful autumn where the leaves blaze in defiance before succumbing to the chill. Jason, a software engineer with a cynical streak, and Wilma, a freelance artist with a soul attuned to frequencies most people ignored, decided to escape the relentless drone of downtown Chicago. Their destination, a remote off-grid cabin nestled deep within the Daniel Boone National Forest. In eastern Kentucky, no cell service, no internet, just the raw, untamed wilderness. Jason called it a digital detox. Wilma, with a shiver she couldn't explain, called it getting lost. They arrived under a sky the color of bruised plums, the air already biting. The cabin was rustic, more shack than sanctuary, but it had a wood-burning stove and a sense of profound isolation that both thrilled and unnerved them. The silence, after Chicago, was deafening. It wasn't an empty silence. It hummed with the unseen life of the ancient woods. The first night, it began. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. Jason, practical as ever, dismissed the faint, rhythmic thrumming as the wind or an animal. Just some old tree groaning. "Babe," he murmured, pulling Wilma closer as she clung to him, her eyes wide and fixed on the impenetrable darkness beyond. Their single window, but Wilma knew it wasn't the wind. It was too regular, too intentional, like a low, guttural chant carried on the night air. And sometimes, she swore, it shifted, sounding like a dozen voices, then one, then none at all, only to resume moments later, closer. By morning, the sun did little to dispel the lingering unease. Wilma was withdrawn, her usual vibrant energy dulled. "I didn't sleep," she said, her voice barely audible. "I kept seeing things." Jason, making coffee, chuckled nervously. Cabin fever already, werewolves and Bigfoot. But the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't fatigue, it was genuine terror. She described fleeting, monstrous shapes at the edge of the tree line, barely visible through the cabin's grimy panes. Not like animals, too tall, too thin. Figures that seemed to stretch and distort, their limbs elongating, their heads tilting at unnatural angles, as if observing them with a slow, deliberate curiosity. "It was like they weren't seeing me with eyes," she whispered, her voice cracking, "but with something else, something cold." Jason, ever the rationalist, blamed it on shadows and an overactive imagination fueled by an isolated setting. But that afternoon, as they hiked a narrow, overgrown trail, even his composure began to fray. The woods felt different. The usual rustling leaves and birdsong were muted, replaced by an unnatural stillness. The canopy above seemed to press down, thick and suffocating. There was a constant, almost imperceptible shift in the air, a scent, like damp earth mixed with something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. And then he saw it too, a flash of movement, too quick to identify, at the edge of his vision. A flicker of something impossibly tall, impossibly slender. receding into the deeper shadows between the colossal oaks, leaving behind only the lingering, oppressive scent. That night was when the true horror set in. The chanting returned, louder now and closer. It seemed to pulse through the very foundations of the cabin, vibrating in their bones. Wilma curled into a fetal position, sobbing, muttering about them being outside. But outside turned into inside. You're watching the flickering shadows cast by the dying embers in the fireplace. The cabin is small, a single room. The walls are thin, uninsulated, letting in every sound. You hear the creak of the floorboards above, even though there's no second story. You see the outline of furniture, familiar and reassuring, until your eyes begin to play tricks. That armrest, ... Is it moving? Is that a darker shadow pooling in the corner, growing, taking shape? Wilma began to hallucinate vividly, her mind a canvas for an ancient, malicious artist. She described figures materializing from the gloom, not solid, but shimmering, translucent, like heat haze given form. They were vaguely humanoid, but their limbs were too long, their fingers tipped with needle-sharp protrusions. Their faces were not faces, but shifting voids, yet she felt their gaze on her, an unbearable weight of malevolent curiosity. One seemed to stand directly over her, its form rippling, whispering words she couldn't understand, but whose meaning she felt in her gut. "You are seen, you are known," she thrashed, screaming, convinced she felt its cold, skeletal touch on her cheek, tracing her jawline. Jason, initially trying to shake her awake, felt the cabin temperature plummet. His breath plumed in the air. The chanting outside became a cacophony, a distorted chorus of guttural wails and high-pitched keening that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. He didn't see the shimmering figures, not clearly, but he felt the presence, an ice-cold dread that permeated every cell. He heard the whispers now too, a low, sibilant hiss that seemed to emanate not from outside, but from the very air around them, right by his ear, right by Wilma's. He saw the shadows on the wall shift and coalesce, forming grotesque, fleeting visages, like faces pressed against a membrane, trying to break through. He swore he saw a pair of glowing red pinpricks of light, like eyes, appear in the darkest corner of the room, unwavering, watching them. "We have to go," Wilma shrieked, scrambling to her feet, her eyes not seeing him, but something beyond him, something directly behind him. They're here, they're inside. Driven by a terror that had finally conquered his skepticism, Jason grabbed her, tossing their minimal bags out the door. The chants outside swelled to an unbearable crescendo, and he heard a definite thump against the cabin wall, a ripple that shook the very structure, followed by a dragging sound, as if something impossibly heavy was being pulled across the ground. Circling them, they stumbled out into the pre-dawn darkness, the cold biting their skin, the screams of the forest echoing in their ears. They didn't look back. They just ran, not knowing where, just away from the cabin, away from the horrors that had finally broken through the veil of perception. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, finally collapsing by the side of the winding mountain road as the first weak rays of sunrise pierced the tree line, revealing nothing but the dense, indifferent forest. They made it out of the mountains that morning, eventually flagging down a passing truck driver who found them huddled and shivering, their faces etched with a horror that transcended words. They never spoke of what happened in that cabin, not to each other, not to anyone. Jason went back to his coding, Wilma to her art, but neither of them were the same. Jason's cynicism was replaced by a haunted quietness, a constant, peripheral glance at every shadow. Wilma stopped painting landscapes, her canvases now filled with swirling, distorted forms and abyssal voids. On the rare occasions they find themselves in a quiet, isolated place, they sometimes catch it, the faint, rhythmic thrumming, like distant drumming or a low, guttural chant carried on the wind. And when that happens, they both instinctively look towards the deepest shadows, knowing that some things, once seen, can never truly be unseen. The Appalachians hold secrets far older than humanity, and sometimes those secrets decide to look back, and they don't forget. You think you're brave. You think you've seen it all on your screens. What if I told you the scariest things aren't the ones you can see, but the ones that twist the very fabric of your mind until you can no longer trust your own eyes, your own thoughts? This isn't a story to scroll past. This is a warning. And if you dare to finish it, if you feel that chill crawl down your spine, then do me a favor. Hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me the creepiest thing you've ever experienced. And for the love of everything holy, subscribe. Because if you don't, who knows what else might find its way out of the shadows, looking for someone else to listen. It was late October, the kind of crisp autumn that bites at your lungs, when Jack and Jilly decided to disappear. Not figuratively, mind you, but literally. They craved an escape from the relentless static of city life in Seattle, the traffic, the endless chatter, the concrete prison. Jack, a software engineer with an unsettlingly precise mind, had found a listing for an off-grid cabin buried deep in a forgotten pocket of the Appalachian Mountains, somewhere between North Carolina and Tennessee. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just trees and silence. "It's perfect, Jilly," he'd said, his eyes alight with a rare spark of adventure, pointing at grainy photos of a rustic log structure swallowed by ancient forest. Just us, the woods, and maybe a few deer. Jilly, an artist whose soul yearned for the wild, had agreed instantly. She pictured sketching beneath towering oaks, breathing air that truly felt clean. They packed their old SUV, filled it with provisions, and drove for days, shedding layers of civilization with every mile. The last leg of their journey was a nightmare unto itself, a winding, unpaved track that eventually vanished into a tunnel of overhanging branches and moss-covered rocks. When they finally found the cabin, nestled in a clearing so quiet it felt like the world had ceased to spin, a strange sense of unease settled over Jilly. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt expectant, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting. The cabin itself was small, 2 rooms built from dark, hand-hewn logs. A narrow porch overlooked a dense wall of trees. Inside, it was cold, musty, and smelled of damp earth and something indefinable. Like old wood and forgotten secrets. You step onto that creaking porch, the air thick with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. The sun is already dipping below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in bruised purples and blood oranges. What does your gut tell you? Does this feel like a sanctuary or a cage? For the first few days, it was idyllic. They hiked, cooked over a crackling fire, and read worn paperbacks by the glow of a kerosene lamp. The crisp mountain air filled their lungs, and the quiet was a balm. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, the quiet began to change. It started with sounds, faint, rhythmic thumps from deep within the forest at night. Not the steady beat of an animal, but heavier, deliberate thump. Thump, thump, like something vast and heavy, taking uneven steps. "Hear that?" Jilly whispered one night, clutching Jack's arm. Jack, always rational, listened. Probably a deer or a bear. Just the woods settling. But Jilly swore she heard something else, too. A whisper carried on the wind, just at the edge of comprehension. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a low, sibilant murmur that seemed to coil around the contours of the cabin. Then came the visual disturbances. Jilly, who spent her days sketching the gnarled trees, began to see things in the periphery of her vision. Shadows that moved when no breeze stirred. Figures that solidified for a split second among the trunks, too tall, too gaunt, before blurring back into the dappled light. "Jack, I swear I just saw someone," she'd say, her voice tight. "Right there, by that old oak." Jack would go investigate, of course, flashlight sweeping the gloomy undergrowth, but there was never anything. Not a single snapped twig, not a displaced leaf. "Honey, you're just not used to the deep woods. Your eyes are playing tricks." But Jilly knew it wasn't her eyes. One afternoon, sketching a particularly ancient, twisted hemlock, she found herself staring at the bark. It wasn't just bark. The knots, the ridges, they began to form patterns. Faces, humanoid, but subtly wrong eyes too deep. Mouths stretched into silent screams. The longer she looked, the more defined they became, as if waking from within the wood itself, there. Agony palpable. She scrambled back, heart hammering, the sensation of being watched overwhelming. You're alone in the woods, sketching a tree, and the bark starts to contort, to show you faces that shouldn't be there. They're staring at you, their expressions a silent testament to unimaginable pain. Do you run? Do you try to rationalize it away? Or do you succumb to the terrifying fascination, drawn closer to examine the impossible? Jack, initially dismissive, began to feel it too. The cabin, once cozy, now felt suffocating. He'd wake in the dead of night, chilled to the bone, convinced someone was standing just outside their bedroom window, breathing. He'd creep towards the pain, heart pounding, but see only his own distorted reflection staring back from the inky blackness. One morning, he found a small, intricately carved wooden figure on the porch. A grotesque, multi-limbed thing made of dark, unfamiliar wood. He knew neither he nor Jilly had put it there. They burned it, the smoke thick and acrid, carrying an unnatural stench. The hallucinations escalated. Jack, pragmatic to a fault, started seeing Jilly in places she wasn't. He'd call her name and she'd answer from the other room. Even as he watched her seemingly stand motionless by the window, her back to him, her posture subtly wrong. Her hair would seem to move, not with the breeze, but as if writhing with something unseen. When he'd blink, she'd be gone, and then appear moments later. Truly, from the kitchen. Jilly, meanwhile, began to struggle with her own reflection. She'd look in the small, tarnished mirror in the cabin, and for a horrifying second, her face wouldn't be hers. Her eyes would be black pits, her mouth a jagged tear, or her skin would take on the mottled grey-green hue of decaying flesh. She'd gasp, splash water on her face, and the normal Jilly would return. But the terror lingered, gnawing at her sanity. One night, the rhythmic thumping outside intensified until it felt like it was directly below the cabin, vibrating through the floorboards. The whispering grew louder, distinct, an unintelligible babble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Jack and Jilly huddled together, eyes wide, listening to the unseen things outside. Then, a scratching began at the walls, soft at first, then growing more frantic. like something desperately trying to get in, its claws tearing at the old wood. "We need to leave," Jilly sobbed, burying her face in Jack's shoulder. Now they put threw their few belongings into the SUV, engines groaning to life in the dead of night. Jack reversed down the narrow, overgrown track, the headlights cutting a desperate swath through the oppressive darkness. But the road wasn't the same. Trees seemed to have appeared where there were none before, forming a twisting, impenetrably maze. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by gnarled, shadowy forms that seemed to shift and writhe at the edges of their vision. You're driving through a forest that has changed, that actively resists your escape. The trees are closing in, their branches like skeletal fingers. You see things in the headlights, fleeting glimpses of distorted figures, eyes glowing in the dark, reflections that aren't yours in the rearview mirror. What do you fixate on, the road ahead, or the terrifying possibilities closing in from all sides? Jilly screamed. Through the windshield, she saw it, a colossal, shadow-shrouded figure standing directly in the middle of the road, its form indistinct, but undeniably massive, reaching towards them with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch into infinity. Jack slammed on the brakes, the SUV skidding to a halt mere feet from the thing. "What is that?" he choked, his face pale with horror. Jilly only cried, pointing, but as Jack stared, blinking, the figure wavered, dissolved, and then reformed into a cluster of normal-looking trees. The road ahead looked clear. "It was just a shadow," Jack whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. He accelerated, desperate to escape, pushing the vehicle faster than was safe. They drove for hours, the sun eventually bleeding a faint gray over the horizon. The trees finally thinned, the road widened, and they saw the first sign of civilization, a dilapidated gas station. They pulled in, shaken, exhausted, gasping for air that didn't taste of dread. They never looked back. They packed up their apartment, sold their things, and moved to a bustling city on the other side of the country. Somewhere, the mountains were only distant, hazy memories. They never spoke of what happened in those Appalachian woods, not to each other, not to anyone. But sometimes, when Jilly looks at her reflection, she still sees the faint, dark pits where her eyes should be, just for a fleeting second. And Jack, rational Jack, still hears the rhythmic thump, thump, thump. Late at night, a sound that doesn't echo in his ears, but in the deepest, most terrified part of his mind. A sound that tells him some things, once seen, can never truly be unseen. Some places never truly let you go. And sometimes, the mountains hold more than just secrets. They hold on to pieces of you. They say the Appalachian Mountains are ancient, sacred lands. But what if some of that ancient power isn't benevolent? What if, sometimes, it just watches? All right, gather round, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a story. It's a memory, a scar, etched deep into the psyche of a man named Jerry. And if you've ever felt that primal chill crawl up your spine, that unshakable dread that tells you you're not alone in the dark, then you know this isn't just fiction. This is the kind of true, insidious horror that lurks in the deep veins of the Appalachian Mountains. It's the kind of story that makes you question the very fabric of reality. And trust me, by the time I'm done, you'll be looking over your shoulder. If you're brave enough to hear this through to the end, do me a favor, hit that like button. Seriously, it helps more people find these chilling tales. And if you have your own inexplicable mountain encounters, drop a comment below. I want to hear them. Just make sure you're subscribed, because trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. So, let's talk about Jerry. Not some character from a movie, but a real guy. Late 20s, an aspiring wildlife photographer from, let's say, a bustling suburb of Cincinnati. He'd always been drawn to the untouched wild, the places where the modern world hadn't quite paved over the ancient mysteries. In October of 2018, a crisp, golden autumn, Jerry packed his gear, filled his tank, and drove deep into the forgotten corners of West Virginia, aiming for a place marked innocuously on old maps as the Blackwood Gap Trail. You see, Blackwood Gap wasn't popular. It wasn't on any major hiking apps, not truly. It was a faint, almost invisible vein running through a vast, ancient forest, the kind of place locals warned you about, with a look in their eyes that wasn't fear, but something far older, far heavier. Jerry, being young and full of an urbanite's misplaced confidence, saw this as an opportunity. Unspoiled nature, unique shots. He was chasing a particular kind of solitude, a break from the relentless hum of city life. The first day was textbook. The air was clean, sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. Sun-dappled leaves, the rustle of unseen creatures, the distant caw of a crow. He set up a rudimentary camp by a winding creek, its water so clear you could count the pebbles. But as dusk bled into twilight, a subtle shift occurred. The woods, which had felt vibrant, began to press in. The sounds that had been comforting, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves, now seemed to amplify, becoming something else. A whisper just at the edge of hearing, like 100 dry leaves skittering across rock. Yet there wasn't a breath of wind. Jerry tried to dismiss it. Fatigue, the unfamiliarity of true wilderness. He cooked a simple meal, the crackle of his small fire a valiant, but ultimately losing battle against the encroaching silence. That night, as he lay in his tent, the silence became a tangible thing, heavy and suffocating. He swore he could hear a steady, rhythmic thud, thump, thump, far off in the darkness. Too regular for an animal, too slow for a heartbeat. It was like something massive, something impossibly ancient, moving with agonizing slowness through the impenetrable black. He pulled his sleeping bag tighter, heart hammering, trying to convince himself it was just the blood rushing in his ears. The next morning, the forest felt different, sharper, more intense. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Every knot on a tree trunk resembled a watchful eye. Jerry found himself constantly scanning the periphery, a prickle of unease crawling up his neck. He tried to focus on his photography, but his lens seemed to magnify the wrong details. A branch twisting into the shape of a gnarled, beckoning finger. A patch of moss forming a pale, silent scream. He swore he saw movement. A flicker deep within the trees, too quick, too fluid to be a deer. A flash of something pale, almost luminous, receding into the dense foliage. He'd raise his camera, but by the time it focused, there'd be nothing but endless trees. He started hearing his name, or something like his name, hissed on the wind. Not loud, not clear, but like a faint sibilant echo, twisting through the branches. Jer, Yi, and then the hallucinations began. Or were they? Jerry was miles from any road, and the mountain air was crisp, so it wasn't dehydration or heat stroke. He'd be walking, focused on the trail, and the path ahead would suddenly shimmer, distort. The trees around him would stretch, their boughs bending into grotesque, skeletal arms reaching for him. The ground beneath his feet would seem to churn, faces of agony and despair swirling in the mud and fallen leaves. He'd blink hard, and it would all snap back into place, just trees, just dirt. But the memory, the terrifying image of what he'd just seen, lingered, cold and real in the back of his mind. He stumbled upon an old, overgrown logging road, almost swallowed by the forest. It seemed to descend further into a hollow, and against his better judgment, a morbid curiosity pulled him down. The air grew colder here, damp and still, carrying the scent of something metallic, like old blood mixed with wet earth. The trees were thicker, older, and their bark was mottled with strange, almost geometric patterns that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. Jerry found himself staring at one, a particularly large oak, and its bark began to swirl. The patterns deepened, forming an intricate, swirling vortex that drew his gaze, pulling him in. He felt a dizzying pressure, a sensation of being stretched thin, like his very atoms were being rearranged. He reached out involuntarily to touch the tree, and his fingers brushed against something unbelievably cold and slick. But it wasn't bark, it was flesh. He snatched his hand back, horrified, but the image was seared into his mind. A vast, unblinking eye, deep brown with a pinpoint black pupil, had opened in the bark, staring directly into his soul. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the ground, vibrating in his teeth. Jerry didn't run, he couldn't. His feet were rooted, his breath trapped in his chest. The forest around him shifted, the trees seeming to lean in, whispering. The whispers became a chorus, a cacophony of ancient guttural sounds, overlapping and swirling, until they coalesced into a single, piercing shriek that tore through the air, a sound that resonated with primal terror and profound despair. His vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer force of the sound, the pressure building in his skull. He saw them then, not clearly, not with his eyes, but with a terrifying lucidity in his mind's eye. Figures, tall and gaunt, their limbs unnaturally long, their faces obscured by shadows and impossibly wide grins. They moved between the trees, blending with the darkness, yet always just visible at the edge of his awareness. They were waiting, not for him to do anything, but just waiting. Jerry doesn't remember how long he was there, paralyzed by the overwhelming presence. He only remembers the agonizing, slow release of the paralysis, the desperate scramble, tripping over roots. He couldn't see, leaves that felt like grasping hands. He ran, not towards anything, but away from everything. Away from the whispers, away from the impossible trees, away from the eye in the bark and the silent, waiting figures. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, collapsing somewhere, on what he later realized was a service road he'd somehow stumbled upon. A passing hunter and grizzled old man with a suspicious squint found him hours later, curled in a fetal position, shivering uncontrollably, muttering about eyes in the trees. Jerry was incoherent, but the hunter, with a knowing look, simply said, "Some places, boy, ain't meant for folk. The mountains, remember." Jerry eventually made it back to Cincinnati, but he wasn't the same. The hum of the city, once a comfort, now felt like a buzzing cage. He rarely sleeps through the night, haunted by the memory of the trees that stared back, the whispers that call his name, and the impossible feeling of ancient flesh beneath his fingers. He still sees them, sometimes, in the corner of his eye. In a crowded room, the gaunt figures, their grins widening in the shadows. He stopped taking photos, especially of nature. He can't shake the feeling that something followed him, something that latched onto his perception in Blackwood Gap, and simply refuses to leave. He calls it a hallucination, a mental breakdown brought on by stress and isolation. But I've seen the look in his eyes, and I've heard the stories about Blackwood Gap, stories older than Jerry, older than any map. They say the mountain itself is alive, that it remembers the ancient ones who walked its paths, and that sometimes it chooses to show you something that rips the veil between worlds. What do you think happened to Jerry in those Appalachian woods? Was it a trick of the mind, or something far more sinister reaching out from the shadows? Share your theories in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious. And if you're still here, still brave enough, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because there are more stories like Jerry's out there, lurking in the forgotten corners of our world, just waiting to be told.